What's up, y'all? How we doing, man? We back after being a little inconsistent. Again, we're getting better. I think this is like what 2 weeks since the last episode I posted, so it's not as bad. But we got a little special episode
Yeah.
for y'all today. We're gonna be talking about just America, foreign policy, and Palestine. We've been wanting to do this episode for a while, but we didn't want to come into it just being like super uneducated about the issues and about what's going on. So we decided to take some of our time and really look into it and study it so we're more equipped to have this conversation about these topics, man.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Malcolm,
man.
looking forward to this.
It was. So it was really AY's idea. We kind of like exchanged words about it. Talking about the world situation. Felt like it was a it for a moment it was pretty much being publicized on like some of the social media outlets. Like social media is like microwave. Like you get like a span of a week or so talking about a particular topic that's pretty hot, and then it kind of fizzle out. But the situation is still relevant, pertaining to just the inequality that's happening over there, and how there's parallels between what's happening here and there, just on a different level. I think oftentimes we kind of get caught up with like what's going, and rightfully so, we get caught up with like what's going on here, in our country, and we don't really pay attention to what's going on in other countries and stuff like that, and how like certain cycles and certain systemic things kind of repeat themselves in other situations. So, but yeah, no, with us looking over pretty much just like the history of the Palestine history, and just a discrepancy between Israel and the Palestinians has been kind of crazy, and how it's like transpired into like a pretty much an ongoing struggle of oppression over there. It's kind of eerie how like it's some of the same things that are like transpiring over there is kind of similar to here, but just in a different like facet. In some cases, worse actually. But we'll get into that. So
Yeah, it's definitely worse. So before we start having a conversation, I just, gonna dive into the history of it a little bit. So I'm gonna give the context, sort of set it up. So the reason why it's such a hotbed issue there and why Israel and Palestine have such big issues comes down to the fact that what people don't
Mhm.
realize is the Zionist movement happens um towards the end of the late 1800s. It really starts picking up speed in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. And then, but basically the Zionist movement is, all Jews should move to the original homeland, which is in Palestine, which is where Israel is today. And it's a big push for this. And then the Holocaust happens. And so what ends up happening is Britain really owns sort of a lot of land in that area and has major
Mhm.
influence in the Middle East, and they had for a while. Um, and so with the rest of the European powers, they agreed to send all of the like as many survivors as they could from the Holocaust who were willing to go to Israel. And the reason why that's a problem is because you have all these Arabic tribes and these Arabic people living in Palestine already who have been living there for centuries and generations. And so you sort of just kick them off their land and sort of just place Israel, this country, with people who had never been to that country, were never from that country,
Mhm.
right there. And so
Right.
that causes conflicts. And at first, the Arabs were kind of really just, kind of mistreating them because they had the power to, and they were sort of making it hard for them. But again, once the
Right.
UN, with like the early remnants of the UN, so like the United States and the UK and some other Western European powers like France sort of step in, and they really help establish Israel.
Yeah.
And so now,
Intervene. Mhm.
Israel is one of America's major allies. And one of the topics we'll talk about later today has to deal with Cuba. But the U.S. has an embargo on Cuba, and every nation in the UN is against that. No, it's not even an embargo. It's like it's like a blockade, essentially. Really, is what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They mentioned blockade that is
Yeah,
transpiring, kind of in the same situation. So
yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah, for
it's a
sure.
blockade of Cuba, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But the reason why I mention that is because every country of the UN is against the U.S. blockade. of Cuba except for the U.S. and Israel. So that lets you know the kind of relationship that we have with Israel. And so a lot of the military spending we do, we also help Israel with their military spending. We help them buy military weapons. We give them advice. We give them like weapons and all this stuff. So America and Israel really tied, and so you start seeing similarities with how much Israel will spend on their defense force and their policing and all this. And so that just adds to the conflict because anytime the Palestinians do something, they can't necessarily do something to the same effect as the Israeli government can just because they don't have the same means. And so what you usually see happen is instead of an eye for an eye, it's more like an eye for a head. So
Right. Eye for
Palestinians might stir
eye.
something up a little bit, but then Israel, knowing that they have this overwhelming majority of force and all these weapons and this technology that the Palestinians don't have access to, they just go out their way to sort of just completely crush these movements and cause massive civilian casualties as long as massive infrastructure damage, and it's all messed up. And so it's parallels between there in American history, a lot of colonialism and a lot of colonies and colonialism and places like Africa and Southeast Asia, but it's something that I don't feel like is necessarily talked about enough. And sort of surfaces on social media I want to say maybe like twice a year, but that's something that happens every day, all the time. Those people in Palestine they're worried about their lives because Israel will drop missiles on them, they'll drop JDM bombs on them, and it'll cause the collapse of all these infrastructure buildings that leads to deaths, and it sort of just it's not right. To put it in layman's terms,
Yeah.
it's not right.
Yeah. Nah. And one thing that I feel like kind of is a parallel is that I think it's interesting that like obviously in 2020 with the pandemic, it kind of slowed the world down and made us pay attention to like some of the things that are going on. But yet and still like something like this, although it like you mentioned, like it did have like its little run on social media outlets, it still kind of slipped under the radar, even though they have a lot of crazy stuff that transpired just last year. So I think that dynamic is kind of crazy. Um, yeah, and as you mentioned, like with the blockades or whatever, like just this last year, they put like a blockade on a good portion of the Gaza Strip that's out there or whatever,
Mhm.
an illegal one at that too. And then like they also did like they also placed like a bunch of like implemented a bunch of like laws that kind of that created discrimination amongst the Palestinians that are there too. And it's kind of crazy how like that kind of slips under the radar. Like we spent like a whole thing about like human rights or whatever in our previous class with the Malcolm Martin and Mandela and stuff like that, and how like human rights supposed to be a universal thing. It's something that we're supposed to prioritize, and yet and still we kind of haven't really like held this situation to that regard. You know what I'm saying? So
It just reminds me that, as much as the US tries to paint themselves as the leader of the free world, the people who try to defend democracy and sort of, being, the people who are supposed to be up front when it comes to human rights and doing the most that they can, they always seem to sort of fail and come short when it comes to either holding themselves accountable or holding other countries accountable who are allies. Because if Russia was doing something like this, U.S. would have no problem. The United States would have no problem jumping on Russia for this. But because it's Israel and we're such close allies with Israel, it's let's just turn the blind eye. Let's pretend this isn't happening, and so that just leads to a lot of people not necessarily knowing
or
what's going on, and a lot of people just may think it's a whole bunch of
yeah,
terrorist organizations over there when I mean, of course, every
right,
movement has some. Of course, there's some, but the proportion that they talk about is untrue. And most of the time, when they do these bombings, sure they might hit their targets, but a lot of the times they're causing massive civilian casualties that is
mm,
really just unacceptable that can be avoided by using different means, but they just refuse to.
yeah, and or as you mentioned, the U.S. will like turn the eye, but they will also try to make it seem as if like it is somewhat deserving or a thing of like self-inflicted, like something that they caused to happen. Because a lot of times, like these attacks be retaliations, quote unquote. When you actually look, into the history bloodline is yeah, it tells another story. So,
Are there anything in the
but
articles that I sent you that we read that really stick out to you, like any stories or any like maybe statistics that really kind of jump out off the page for you?
Yeah, so this thing has been going on for like as a well about to be the 14th consecutive year. But in the article that you sent, the illegal air, land, and sea blockade of like the Gaza Strip that I just like mentioned, whatever, has been in place for over 13 years or whatever. And that's keeping people from leaving, and that's keeping goods from coming in and out of the area, which pretty much creates inequities amongst groups of people. Obviously, the Palestinians. So not only are they are being restricted from, you know, human rights in the regard of like being discriminated against, but the overall just the overall access to things to live is being restricted as well too. So it's not just a matter of like it's not just a matter of like implicit stuff. It's also like physical things that they're being kept away from. And it's been going on for like the 13th year. Something that's literally illegal of a blockade. I haven't, and the thing is though, it's crazy because like looking into this, like I know we like we're dealing with blockades like like centuries ago, and I'm like, oh, that's not really that shouldn't be that existent or it shouldn't be that prevalent now, but it still is, and it's been going on for like over a decade, and nothing. We haven't done nothing about it really. It's kind of crazy.
I think it's important to mention that one, Palestine technically isn't its own country. It's just like it's different areas that sort
Right.
of it's weird because it'd be easier to illustrate on a map, but on a map, if you look at it, you got Israel sort of in the center, and then
Mm-hmm.
the areas that are reserved for the Palestinians are sort of in different directions. They're not even connected, which is another way that they can sort of, you know, help separate these people and keep them from uniting and keep their movements sort of dormant as long as they can. So like the Gaza Strip is on
Mm-hmm.
the western side of the country. That's one area that they live
Yeah.
in. And I mean, I think that's where most of them live because there's like 2 million people that live in the Gaza Strip. And that area is
Mm-hmm.
its own area. I'm pretty sure it's surrounded by by like the rest of Israel on that point, and then it's like I think two or
Mm-hmm.
three other sections just sort of in the middle of nowhere when it comes to like in relationship to like where the Gaza Strip is, and so uh I think that's part of the reason why we don't hear about it as much as in it and why you know Israel is able to sort of hide it under the rug just because Palestine isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily its own country, and so they're still trying to fight to become their own country, and that definitely plays a major factor into why we don't hear about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's just like it's one of those things that's easy to sweep under the rug, and it's like it's very easy to sweep it under the rug, and hence the reason we have a cop out of not really speaking much about it. Did you kind of want to go into like you kind of like alluded to a little bit of the history of it, but did you kind of want to go into the history of like pretty much Israel trying to establish their power in its first origins and how that transpired into like this
Yeah,
struggle,
well, I mean,
this
well,
power struggle.
part of the issue will always come down to just you know religion, the fact that Palestinians are Muslim and the Israelis are Jewish, and so
Right.
just alone that tends to bring a lot of conflict, especially in that area. And you know, in an area that's been always predominantly dominated by in terms of like I want to say from like the 1500s on, uh, by
Mhm.
by Islamic presence. Israel is just sort of this like sore thumb that sticks out because they're in an area where everybody that surrounds them, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all those countries are Muslim, and they're the only
Mhm.
sort of country that's not heavily Islamic. Now, again, it's sort of difficult just because Jerusalem is just a special case where Jerusalem is sort of split into three sections where you have a Christian sector, a Muslim sector, and a Jewish sector. Just because Jerusalem is just is an important city in all three religions. That's an
Mhm.
important city. There are important sites there. So, of course, that's one of the that city is sort of divided, but a lot of a lot of them trying to establish their power at the beginning was just because they were a new country. 1948, they had just gotten settled there. in these Arabic countries like Egypt were trying to just wipe them out and sort of just sweep them under the rug, put them somewhere so they didn't have to deal with them. And so for about like 10 years, I think, I'm pretty sure it's like around 10 years, you have Israel just really trying to fight to establish themselves as a country, even though people like the United States and the UK and France all acknowledge that they were their own sovereign nation. You have them sort of fighting to sort of
Right.
establish the borders and just make sure that they're their own country. But now, since they have sort of the power dynamic has switched, and part of that has switched just because in like the 70s and in the 60s, the 70s and 80s, I'm pretty sure there's just a series of wars between like they're short wars. They're like, I think the longest one might be 2 weeks, but one of them is like 5 days. So just it's a series of like short wars between like Israel and Egypt, and like Israel and Jordan, and Egypt and Jordan sort of joining forces just to, again, to sort of just wipe them out and sort of move them from that area. And so you can understand why Israel is sort of just a little hostile, just because the neighboring countries to Israel have sort of always been hostile to them. And I understand, the need to defend your homeland. But the problem that we have is the fact that you have these people who, you took their land from them. You sort of, it sort of reminds me of reservations. Now they're bigger than reservations, but again, this really just reminds me of reservations in the terms that you've pushed these people off of their land, pushed them into just these sections that you've marked out for them, and you just constantly harass, abuse them, restrict their education, medical supplies, just basic human rights in general. You subject them to torture. You bomb the hell out of them. You just do all these things to these people, and that's where we sort of draw the line. I feel like the big reason why, again, Israel is just so tends to react as they do is just because, again, for decades people around them have been trying to stomp them out, and so now that they're established, they're really like, okay, well, it's important to show power, to show strength, so we're just going to keep trying to flying anybody that we can in order to keep defending ourselves and make ourselves look big and powerful.
Yeah, no, it always like there's always byproducts when stuff like this happens, right? So obviously, like now it's like the Palestinians and Israelites have like a feud, right? And it reminds me of when we were talking about how like the African tribes, right? Eventually the Zulu tribe was trying to establish dominance over the entire um region of Africa or whatever, or the South Africa or whatever. And by them doing it and pushing a lot of other tribes out of their area, it actually allowed Europeans to come over into the empty areas and eventually establish their power. So it's kind of crazy how like by a person trying to establish power over a particular area, right? It creates byproducts that they don't expect to happen. So I don't know. It just reminded me of that, just how um, trying to establish power can create other outcomes that you don't really want to happen. So, but we froze a little bit.
I wasn't moving.
Good
I
thing
don't
we
think
have
I
that.
froze. But
Oh, I was about to say, I didn't know if you froze or you
yeah,
were
but I
moving,
was just just
but
going through all these, like, just a timetable of the wars that I was talking about. So again, we got the sort of the one that really begins everything, which is the Arab Israeli war, which again that happens when Israel's declared, given that land, declared their own country. Then we have the Suez Crisis, which involves Britain and France trying to help Israel out. The 6 Day War is one of the major
the
ones
Six
where
Day
it's,
War is probably the one most prominent.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of the most prominent. Which again, it's 6 days in June of 1967, and it involves Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. That's
Mm-hmm.
sort of basically try to invade Israel, and they fail. Um, Another big one is the War of Attrition, which again they sort of have like just sort of like minor battles in it. But Yom Kippur is another major one that people talk about, which only happened, I think, for like was another one with 20 days, where it was Egypt and Syria again, sort of being in this coalition to sort of go ahead and fight against Israel again. And so you can understand why just in that little span from like 1948 to like 1973, all of those wars where people were really just trying to wipe them out off the face and take their country out of that way. And I feel like part of it is again because they feel bad for their fellow Muslims who and their fellow Arabs who are trapped in Palestine and sort of objected to this treatment. Um,
Mhm.
but again, just because you've other countries have tried to wipe you out doesn't mean you have the right to just deny people human rights and just try to make people's lives as hard as they can, sort
Mhm.
of try to squeeze them out of the existence and then try to turn a blind eye to it when people try to call you out on it.
Yeah, no, and it's a sticky situation because like we talked about the illegal blockades and just like a bunch of the legislation that they passed to pretty much oppress these Palestinians, right? And it kind of makes me think of how we talked about here, where there was two routes we kind of like tried to utilize to kind of fight for freedom. One was the legislative route, trying to change legislation to be a little bit more aimed towards human rights, right? But even still, there's loopholes in that. And then obviously the route of utilizing violence and protest. And in this situation or whatever, like the one thing that differs of both our nation's situation and the other nation's situation is that with us, at least through our protesting and through our through the routes that we take in that, we can at least like gain the attention of the nation in that regard. Whereas I feel like for their situation, they're already like they're already illegal laws that like are discriminating against them, and there's already violence being provoked onto them. So it's like they're kind of at a bind, like and like I said, our situation is a little different in that, we've I know we like to say that like they're like we take one step and then come take like five steps backwards, whatever. But there's at least been progress in that, like there is. We've shown that we can kind of change legislation. We've shown that through at least like a persistent amount of protesting, we can at least garner their attention. These Palestinians are in a situation where, regardless of legislation, regardless of if they try to fight back, things are only going to get matter like the matters are only going to get worse for them. So it's kind of, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a hopeless situation, but it's most definitely a situation um, that is going to require some type of intervention or require some like another force to intervene somehow or some way, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. It's two other topics we want to talk about today. We're gonna go ahead and start talking about just Cuba. I know it's a little late because Cuba one, I think it's just to talk about Cuba because this year I forget when, I want to say maybe 3 months ago at this rate, uh, Cuba started coming into the U.S. sort of news circuit, talking about how people are
Mm,
protesting the communist government there, and Cuba is tired of communism. We should sort of try to step in and intervene and release them from communism. And with that and sort of the blockade, this trade blockade that we have, I think it's interesting to really just tie that in with Palestine and what's going on. So just so y'all know, those protests that you see, um that where they're talking about, we don't want communism anymore, a lot of people, including myself, and just if you really do some research and start looking into it, you'll find that one, a lot of the footage that the people like CNN and Fox use tend to be from counter protests of that, and the counter protests of the protests that we've been seeing that are talking about, we should get rid of communism in Cuba, have really been, it's been big. They've been bigger than those. And I think it's funny because I remember the video I sent you, he's talking about how they showed a clip on Fox News talking about, oh, look at these people protesting. But one of
mm,
the people had a sign that had
mm,
a sign that had the picture of, I might butcher his name. It's like Che Guevara, which if you don't know who he is, he's sort of this prominent communist figure from Argent. I'm pretty sure he's from Argentina. But he's sort of, in a lot of South American and Central American countries, when they start talking about communism and revolution, um, he's a constant face of that. And so just seeing his face in one of those footages and hearing, the people in Cuba talk about how they don't want capitalism, they're fine with how their government is, really just shows that, again, and it'll relate to American foreign policy, which will probably be our fourth topic and our final topic today. But it just relates to how America just sort of, especially in South America, tends to really meddle in their elections and put their hand in it and sort of, if somebody who's a socialist or a capitalist is selected, you'll find that a lot of the times there are coups that happen in those countries, and those coups are sort of started and funded by the United States. And so a lot of people, including myself, are starting to think that the U.S. has had a lot of hand in those protests and trying to flip the narrative that Cuba is a communist country that's really suffering, when Cuba ranks higher than the United States in a lot of categories. I'd have to I need to watch that video to refresh my memory, but I can look it up real quick while you talk about your thoughts about the video.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that, and it really, really like painted the picture as you, and the key thing that you mentioned was just painting a narrative or trying to reconstruct the narrative to kind of coincide with the propaganda that obviously America has, and I feel like that always has kind of played a role when it comes to trying to preserve the image of America. So yeah, you mentioning the fact that, like, when they show these protests or whatever, they usually show the protests that kind of coincides with the psyche of America. And I feel like that is always going to happen, especially when you deal with politics or whatever, because at the end of the day, like the thing that we're trying to preserve the most is America's image, and also the propaganda that they're trying to spew out to not only the people obviously the people in the country, but also to the other people that they're trying to that they're interacting with when it comes to foreign policy. But no, it surprised me in that how it's executed to a certain extent, but it doesn't surprise me that it's happening, if that makes sense, because it's kind of been expressed in multiple facets historically. So, but no, it's we've always had a weird way of of how we went about engaging in foreign policy, especially when it comes to countries that oppose some of the views that we have. Um, so yeah, like we're if out of all the countries, we're probably, like, if there was a king capitalist, our country would probably be of the upper echelon in that regard.
Yeah, it
And
really
I
does.
think it'd be
Go ahead.
interesting. Go ahead, my bad.
You're fine. You're fine. I can wait. Keep going.
No, I was just gonna say, I think it's also very, very important. And I actually I want to thank you for teaching me this or whatever. It's very, very important to understand the basis of communism before looking to the implications, because a lot of times, like, you know, being a communist or communism has an implication, and that implication kind of changed the actual root of what it's supposed to be and what it means, as opposed to how it's practiced. So
Yeah, in that
um
in that video, in one of the two videos I showed you, I think it's interesting how the dude talks about, he looks at release papers from the government talk about the Soviet Union, how that even the CIA understood that the type of communism that the Soviet Union was practicing wasn't necessarily exactly what Karl Marx was referring to when he came up with the idea of communism. And so it's just interesting. But at the end of the day, the reason why America is just so against communism and socialism just comes down to the fact that it would affect a lot of people's ways of life. And as Americans, people don't want that to happen. And being able to see like all these other countries, especially countries that are sort of just very close to America, they're afraid that if especially when Jamaica was becoming independent, because I remember we talked about this in our hip hop class. The America and the CIA had eyes on Jamaica, and they wanted to see if they would become a communist country or not. And that just comes down to the fact that America is very aware of how influential other movements can be around the world to America. And so they
Mm,
wanted to keep Jamaica from being communist because they were afraid that it would inspire and show people that, oh, it's a way other than communism that can, leads to better equality of life. Because at the end of the day, people fail to realize that, like, for example, the continent of Africa, the reason why the continent of Africa is so messed up today and they have so many problems within these countries today comes down to the fact that when these European countries were colonizing Africa, they came to a point where they sat down, had a map of Africa, and they said, okay, Germany, you can have. I'm pretty sure they had like where the Democratic Republic of Congo is. I'm pretty sure that used to be a German colony. France has where like Morocco and Algeria was. So France has a major part of North Africa, except for Egypt because of the Suez Canal. That was mainly
mhm,
British land, and Britain had like Kenya and I think Nigeria and all these other countries. But the thing is, what people don't realize is, and you can see the results of stuff like this and things like the Rwanda genocide, is you just grouped tribe. One, you took advantage of the land's natural resources and,
mhm.
really hampered the people's ability to live out those natural resources and really gain monetary value and capital from their own resources because you were taking them. But two, in places like Rwanda, you have the Hutu and the Tutsis who really don't like each other. They're constantly fighting, and so you group them together in one country and say, okay, now you guys are forced to live together. So you sort of force a whole bunch of tribes who and groups of people who really don't like each other have been at war with each other, and that leads to things
Adversaries,
like
yeah,
like the Rwanda genocide, where you know governments swing, and once one government gets into power, they're like, okay, we're just gonna try to completely annihilate and wipe as many people of the opposite side or the opposite group of people, the opposite tribe as we can. And so a lot of those problems and a lot of the instability in Africa has come from the fact that Africa was taken advantage of for so long from natural resources and capitalism, really, and it just really comes down to the fact that in capitalism, especially how it's been practiced, there always has to be a group of people taken advantage of. Like now,
absolutely.
in colonial times, and we still see it in Africa, because a lot of countries still own land in Africa. They take oil from there. Like any diamond you get, diamonds usually come from Africa along with a lot of gold. But we see that especially now in like sort of the middle class in America, and what people don't realize is in a lot of countries, one, the minimum wage is not, it's not enough to really like be able to live in an apartment and pay rent and pay rent and have electricity and light bills and food bills and all this stuff to really live comfortably. But Americans are so stubborn that these companies understand that they can outsource these jobs to people who are from like Mexico, for example, or other Latin America countries, or like sweatshops in like Southeast Asia, where they can pay these people, get away with paying these people a lot less money. And so now you're taking advantage of these people who are working in these inhumane conditions and making like barely enough money to make a living. But at the end of the day, they're willing to do so just because they understand that they need the money. So you're taking advantage of this group of people and sort of keeping them there. And I'm not sure about this. I would have to do a survey myself, but I feel like I'll ask you this. In a capitalist country, who do you think is in charge of creating the job market? Like who controls the job market? Basically, who's in charge of creating jobs?
I would honestly go with like the owners, really. I mean, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, I mean, obviously you're gonna give me like an answer. It's probably opposed to what I think, but honestly, I would go with like the owners. At the end of the day, they control this, pretty much control the. Well, no, well, I would say like obviously the consumer controls the demand, but in terms of like the supply or whatever, and how much you're going to like distribute, that kind of is in the hand of the owner, and
Um,
more often.
so how capitalism is supposed to work is supposed to be the middle class, sort of, which is really who controls the market. They're supposed to be the
Mm,
one that controls the jobs, because they're the ones who are setting the precedent of what's popular, what you want to buy, and what you don't want to buy. And so I
the
think a lot of,
demand or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. They're the ones responsible for creating the demand, and you can't have a supply without the demand. But it's really the middle class who are in charge of making things popular, right? Without the middle class, Amazon is not able to be as big as it is, not nearly as big as
Mhm.
it is. They also don't necessarily get the type of as many enough workers that they need to. So it really comes down to the fact that it's supposed to be the middle class who are creating the jobs in a capitalist economy, and sort of that that sort of doesn't really necessarily happen. And I think it's because the people who are high up, well, one, you have to understand that a lot of people who are in like the Senate and Congress and the House of Representatives, a lot of people who are in politics are also rich and wealthy, and so they benefit from all these tax cuts and all these policies that really benefit business owners and the people like the Jeff Bezos of the world. And so I feel like it's been a very strong movement to sort of misguide people on one what socialism and communism really is in America, because those people really care about their money and their wealth and their status. But two, we also don't. This I don't think it's enough education telling people that it's really the middle class who are in charge of creating jobs in a capitalist society, because that you would allow the middle class to sort of gain power. Um, Reminds me of my senior year first semester. We were in it was my religion and film class, and our teacher was talking about how come talking about like how much money people make is sort of a taboo subject, right? You can't just walk up to somebody in the
Mm,
street and sort of ask them, how much money do you make a year? That's sort of a taboo subject. That's something you're not supposed to do.
right.
And we started talking about the reason
Mm,
why is because if you were to learn, like if you were to sit there and really be able to look at how much money somebody like a Jeff Bezos is making compared to somebody like even a Donald Trump, and you start really looking at those amounts and you look at how much money Jeff Bezos really has compared to somebody even like Donald Trump or compared to you and I, you would start to see that something's just not quite right. And so the people in the middle class would be like, hold up, they have way too much money. They have way more money than they need. How about we get some of that? And so, again, it comes down to the fact that they be afraid of revolution. And I could identify that. Jalen was in that class with me, and Peck, they were both in that class. And we could, like, all three of us could identify it, but the people in our class had trouble identifying, like, why it's a taboo subject, why you don't want people to know exactly how much, like, $30 trillion is. It really is. I said trillion, $30 billion really is in money, because once people start to
mhm,
really understand and get a sense of how much money that really is, it's going to be problems, because then people are like, well, you have money that you can give to us to help us who are suffering, help us who are in lesser and more unfortunate situations. And so it just comes down to that. And that's really what America is scared of, is just sort of just another revolution where the middle class, I feel like, socialism started to become more and more acceptable, especially with people in our generation, because, I think we're starting to enter an age where people are really starting to really do their research in history and realize that capitalism is really not working, and it's not fulfilling all these promises of trying to help people out. I think one of the strengths of capitalism, which is also what really hurts it, is the fact that anybody, it doesn't matter where you're born in life necessarily, anybody can get rich. But at the same time, with that, the people who are rich sort of try to do their best to restrict people who can become rich and get to that status.
and
And that's what people don't
that's why I
understand.
say, yeah, and that's why I say it's hard to defeat capitalism, because it's like it's no like it's no secret that it's wrong, right? But it's very hard for somebody to make all this money and want to give it away just so everybody can have an equal share. It's very hard. And then like you got people, for instance, we can do this about professional players,
Hmm.
right? They like you like some of the professional players, you know what I'm saying, are knowledgeable about the fact that like they shouldn't be making this much money just playing like professional ball, right? But there's the other side that's saying, well, I'm the one that is, selling all these jerseys. I'm the one that's making all these people watch me play. I'm the one that, you know what I'm saying? So it's very
Hmm.
hard. Another thing is it's very hard to define value, a monetary value at that too. And that's why capitalism is such a slippery slope when it comes to like trying to, and that's why it's hard to. And then when the genesis of how our country is created is based on it, it's very hard to not only look at alternative and make it look better, but it's also very hard to want to or it's very hard to make people want to deconstruct the system that, you know, is for the most part in their regard helping them. So because I
It's
feel like everybody knows that like capitalism is probably not the best route for the majority, because obviously there wouldn't be a top 1%, but it's human nature for people to want to preserve what they have. So
it's interesting because capitalism isn't necessarily bad. Like again, all three of these uh economic structures, communism, socialism, capitalism, aren't necessarily bad in themselves. It's really just how they're implemented. Because what people have to understand is when the Great Depression hits, capitalism was great for sort of really being able to dig the middle class out of that debt and sort of give them jobs with people with the president Franklin. Dang, why am I? I don't know why I'm having so much trouble, but FDR and his sort of
yeah,
damn, what is it like New Deal? Yeah, his New
yeah,
Deal
yeah, the
and
New
out creating all
Deal,
those
yeah,
jobs, like building up the Hoover Dam and all that stuff. Really, at the end of the day, that's sort of this capitalistic movement that really, again helps build the country. But I think the reason why that is so successful is because again, it put the middle class at the focus, which is really what's supposed to be really for all economic systems. That's how it's supposed to be because most people are going to fall in the middle class. But that's why that was so successful in bringing people out of debt, because FDR realized that if he wants to bring the nation out of debt, he has to put the emphasis on the middle class because that's where the markets are going to come from. That's where the people who are really putting money back into the economy is really the middle class who do that. And so you have to revitalize them if you want a healthy economy. Now, I always hear people really, especially older people, talk about oh, communism never works. If you look at all these countries that were communist, they don't work, and that's not necessarily true. I mean, again, with Russia is always the biggest. The Soviet Union always the big example. And what people don't understand is part of the reason why communism fails there is just because of people like Stalin who take it as this dictatorship, and now they have like these great purges where they're killing, or he's killing like political opponents or people who might disagree with them, or he's even killing people within his own inner circle just to sort of remain as that top dog so he can hold on to his power. Um, but yeah, anytime you mention communism, people just automatically think of a dictatorship. Now, I understand why, because it's probably
mm-hmm.
easier to have communism exist in a dictatorship. But again, you go back to Karl Marx's readings, he mentions nothing about communism having to be under this dictatorship, and I think that's what people fail to realize. And so people always want to say all these bad things about Marxism, communism. All communism really is just the government controlling the means of production, and socialism is the workers, so that's the middle class really controlling the means of production, and then capitalism is just letting private business owners really own the means of production, be able to own that. And so that's why ownership is so big in countries like America. And owning land is a great way of making money because if you're that's how Donald Trump has made a lot of his money. I don't think people understand that he used to be this real estate agent, and so that's something that's not taxed. So he can own all this land that he's trying to sell, and that's not going to get taxed. So he doesn't have to put that when he's in his taxes. He's doing taxes. He doesn't have to put that in there. That's money that he can put a whole bunch of money into that business and not have to pay that back in taxes. And so that's something that really helps people grow wealth. But I'm gonna say this one thing, then we can move on. Uh, I took a philosophy economics class at Wabash, and Thomas Hobbes is somebody who, whenever we really talk about capitalism, somebody I always think about in these conversations. And so he talks about how so the I'll do it like this. There's an apple tree that exists, right? Nobody owns a yard. The apple tree just exists in a forest and in nature. So technically, the apples belong to anybody. You just have to put the work in
That's
for it. So if
ownership.
I go over
Mm-hmm.
there and I climb the tree and I pick an apple, that apple is mine because I put in the time and the work and the labor to get to that apple. What capitalism is okay. Now somebody buys the land that tree is on, and so since the tree is on their land, they own that tree, and therefore by owning that tree, they own all the apples on that tree. Now, as a worker, I can go and do the job and pick the apples. They'll probably hire me. I can go and pick the apple. But now I have to give them a certain percentage of that apple that I picked, right? So let's say I pick an apple and I have to give them, this is a absurd amount, but I pick an apple and I have to give them half of the apple just to keep just to keep half of the apple that I've decided to put the time and the work and the energy in picking, just because they simply own the land. And I think that just sort of that analogy illustrates a lot of the problems that can be had with capitalism. It's just you can take advantage of the workers because the workers don't necessarily own the business. The business owner owns the land that the business is on, and he owns the businesses. So even though he has to pay you a wage, he's really only paying you a portion that's not even closely or remotely close to what sort of your labor is actually worth, and he's making millions off of your labor while you're only getting paid something like $7.25 an hour. And I always like using that example, and that I find that really opens people's eyes to the problems that can arise in a capitalist society.
Yeah, nah, I always looked at capitalism as exploitation and opportunity, exploiting an opportunity. Um, yeah, in short, that's how I always looked at it as. And like I said, it's tough because, you know, like you mentioned, like anybody could become rich. I mean, obviously there's people that have an easier route if like they inherit it or whatever. But like I'm saying, like in terms of like capitalistic structure, if you start up a business and it gains traction and you're the owner, you know what I'm saying? Like it's just, yeah, I don't know. And like I said, it's human nature to want to preserve the goods that you have, right? Like people, even philanthropists, right? Like even people that want to give back are going to give back to a certain degree. You know what I'm saying? Like like you've never really seen a philanthropist drop from being like a millionaire to like middle class, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Like you know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So yeah, yeah.
So the final topic today, we'll talk about American foreign policy, but it really just relates to because this is a major life event for us. Just the war in Afghanistan sort of really finally closing, coming to an end, because we've been in Afghanistan for about 20 years, which is really the majority of my life. For as long as I can remember, we've been in
Mm.
Afghanistan and Iraq, and so I just wanted, we didn't do any research about that necessarily, but I just wanted, I just want to have this conversation with you, Malcolm, and talk about how you feel that went. And so I guess my first question I want to ask, which I feel like a lot of people, especially news channels, have asked, would be, were we successful in our mission in Afghanistan? This of course means you have to first state what you believe our mission was in Afghanistan in the first place.
Well, so the so the proclaimed mission from the United States was the quote unquote war on terror or whatever, fighting terrorism, right? Um, in that regard, no, I don't think we were successful in that because I still think things are transpiring and terrorism happens on multiple planes than what they perceive it to be. So no, in that regard, and honestly, the that's the message that they're spewing out, right? But like their actual like their ulterior motive or whatever, ulterior motive, excuse me, of just wanting to control Afghanistan. Um, in that regard too, I don't even think they were successful either. In fact, I just feel like and I've always kind of been conflicted when it comes to just the military, especially the U.S. military, because I feel like to a certain extent, when it comes to our military, like a lot of our like missions are to intrude in other people's like places, and you know that is wrong. But at the same time, like when you like these are still people putting their life on the line for our country. So I've always been kind of conflicted when it comes to like you know people going to Afghanistan, right? Or just even when we did even the Vietnam War, right? Like I'm conflicted in that regard because it's like it's a war that we shouldn't have took part in, but it's still like human beings who like put their life at risk for the sake of our country. You know what I'm saying? So I never really tried to speak any ill will towards that, but just I guess to just tie it up all to tie it back all in. I don't think we were successful in any way. I feel like it was honestly a waste of time, and I honestly think it was just obviously with the just with the scares that we've had, right? Like we just don't mention to talk about whatever, but obviously with the scares that we've had in the past 20 years or whatever, we wanted to establish dominance and control over a perceived threat, and I don't feel like we really achieved it in the way that we wanted to achieve it. So I would just say no. Like I feel like we didn't really accomplish what we wanted to accomplish, in
Oh
my
God.
opinion.
I'll probably catch some flack for what I'm about to say, but you know me, I'm an honest person. Again, not to take away anything from the soldiers, but I just think when people say, they're protecting my rights and they're protecting my freedom, um, it's just not true. And that to me, that really hasn't necessarily been true in America's case since really World War II. And the main reason why I say that is because, Japan declared war on the U.S. and Germany declared war on the U.S. So at that rate, okay, I can understand. You're serving, you're trying to protect your country because they've just been threatened, and sort of the Navy sort of destroyed, the Pacific Fleet almost destroyed, and you have these two countries coming to you aggressively and saying, okay, we want to go to war with you, right? I can't blame them, but
Mhm.
in situations like Vietnam, for example, the only reason why we get involved in Vietnam is because again, the whole domino effect theory where one country becomes communist in a region, then every other country with it will sort of become communist. And America being anti-communist doesn't want that to happen. So with Vietnam, the whole original plan is you separate Vietnam from North and South, right? And then you let them have an election, and whoever comes out on top, that's what that whole country was going to be. And the United States agree, and the United States and Russia they agree to this, but the United States ended up backing out of this deal because they realized that the communists are going to far outweigh the people who are in South Vietnam. Like most people in Vietnam were, I'm pretty sure they lived in North Vietnam, but they were also communists. And so America, realizing that they're going to lose this, decides to say, "Nah, we're not even going to do this. We're going to essentially go to war and we're going to fight for this." And it's just sort of this big waste of time because at the end of the day, you have people who are really fighting for their country, fighting for their freedom, and America is really trying to take away these people's freedom and being able to have a democratic election and really elect who they want to be. And so I think people really overlook just how traumatic that whole Vietnam experience is because you have a lot of people who are drafted there. And so the thing with Afghanistan is it's all been volunteers, right? We haven't had a draft since Vietnam. So it's been strictly volunteers who have gone to Vietnam to fight. I said to Vietnam, to Afghanistan, Iraq to fight. So it's sort of patriotism and pride in your country. Now I understand, the 9/11 terrorist attacks and all that. But when we invade countries like Iraq, like people like, they have weapons of mass destruction, which has never been proven. And so people think, the United States wanted their oil or just a sort of fuck, how do I want to say this, basically sort of flex their muscle and really gain more influence in that region. It's sort of the same thing with Vietnam. It's just that with Vietnam you have a lot of people who are getting drafted, so now you have people who are fighting people in a who you have people who are fighting a land they're not familiar with against people who are really fighting who have been fighting for centuries because people often forget that Vietnam used to be a French colony,
Right.
and so they had to gain independence from France, and now they're fighting America, who they see as essentially another colonial power trying to take their freedom, their country away from them. So you have people who are really fighting for their freedom, their country, against somebody who maybe 18, 19, 20 years old and just got drafted and doesn't even want to be there and has no idea why they're even there in the first place. And so, of course, that affects the fighting because if you don't want to be there, you're not going to want to fight, right? If you're not going to, a volunteer army is going to be a lot more effective than a drafty army, just because the volunteers want to be there. They're there because they want to be there. Where a drafty is like, damn, I'm forced to be here. And no, I'm not saying I'm not grateful for the soldiers, everything they do, and the sacrifices they make. I understand that, but I think to try to always say that what they're doing is protecting the country, I think it's just not
Mm.
true. Just because America is just always intervening in sort of undermining what all these other countries are doing when it comes to their democratic processes, especially in Latin America. And also, I don't think Afghanistan was successful, and I think the main thing that you can look and see why it was successful is look how fast it took. Like, look how fast not the yeah, it is the Taliban, isn't it? Yeah, look how fast, or is it Al Qaeda? No, it's Taliban. It's the Taliban. I'm tripping. It's the Taliban. Look how fast the Taliban were able to recontrol that country once the United States left, and so it's sort of like we were there for 20 years, and our mission was sort of to destroy, try to get Afghanistan to have this democratic nation that could be operated safely, but it just didn't work. And to be honest, Afghanistan has been at war for generations. Like, generations of people have known nothing but war, between the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan to the America leaving and the Taliban just sort of running rampant there now. Um, and so I'm pretty sure America's job was, their goal was to implement a democratic government that was elected and ran by the people without the influence of the Taliban. And just given what happened as soon as they left, and how the Taliban really just started taking control of the country again, I think it's, for one, definitely a failure.
Yeah. And then just going back to like the military aspect and like your stance about like people trying to framing it as they're fighting for our rights. I've always been very very careful, in particular, in saying like when it comes to stuff like that, and I want people to understand it, like, and notice how I said they were fighting for our country, representing our country. So I feel like representing our country and fighting for our rights are two completely different things. Like, I have respect for them for the sake of them putting their life on the line for our
Yeah, same,
country, but
same.
I don't necessarily think the motive. Yeah, I don't necessarily think the motive really is justified, if that makes sense. You know,
I think
and I've
people
always,
just
and especially with the Vietnam War. I was just gonna say, especially with the Vietnam War, because a lot of you know, people of color have took part in that, thinking that, and pretty much it was all a ploy, because a lot of people of color ended up going fighting for the Vietnam War, came back and still didn't have anything to show for it, still being discriminated against, and it's always been a thing. Even in like the Second World War, where we took part in that, and they treated us like second class citizens once again. You know what I'm saying? So I always pay my respects to the people that's in the military, especially the people of color in the military, because not only are they willingly helping the nation that particularly doesn't really even like, place them at the statue they're supposed to be placed at, but just a matter of like, other human beings trying to fight and representing our countries is something I hold dear to me, just obviously because I have family
yeah,
members in the military.
yeah.
But I've always been cognizant of the fact that sometimes when we're engaging in these wars, the actual intent and motive isn't really justified.
Yeah, like I said, America is sort of a modern day imperial power when you look at all the bases we have around the world, whether that's in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe. And so I think people, when you try to say that they're defending my rights and my freedom, I don't think that's true, just because at the end of the day, what people fail to realize is most of the time America is intervening and sort of undermining these democratic elections and these democratic processes, to the point where they're putting in people who may agree more with America, and maybe, sort of puppet governments who will listen to America, their interests, but they're sort of like these tyrannical figures in the countries that America ends up putting them in. And so and yes, like I understand what I respect I respect the people in the military just because that's a hard decision. That's a life that's not for everybody. I understand. You obviously have to have people who are willing and ready to defend your country. But at the same time, I think people just need to realize that majority of the time, that's not what they're used for. They're used to sort of prolong just America's ability to influence, undermine, and sort of destroy a lot of countries, whether that's their economy or just intervene in their elections or intervene in some way to where we're like, okay, we want to have the main influence in this country, not because it'll benefit the people of this country, because it'll benefit our interests in that country, and we want to secure our interests around the world and be able to be this global power and have say in all these other countries instead of really trying to defend our country and our freedom, or as the American military's mission also claims, to secure democracy elsewhere in the world and really help those people. And I think that's where people sort of get sort of swept up in patriotism and all that stuff. And so I just think it's important to really tell people and have people really look at it and look at history and be honest with themselves, and really be like, well, damn, these people are sort of really being taken advantage of to try to secure the interest of American politics. Um, yeah, I think I'll ask you one more. Yeah, I got one more question to ask. Whew, damn, I forgot it. I had one question to ask. Um, it'll come to me. Just give me a second.
Yeah, nah. But I really enjoy the topics that we touched on. We usually don't really get a chance to talk about things that are happening on an international scale. It's usually stuff that's going on with our nation, and just kind of put it in perspective of how our quote unquote nation, our world, isn't that much different from others. Um, while he's looking or thinking of his question in this next topic, I don't know if he's frozen or not. Sometimes he'd be
I'm
looking
not
down
frozen.
so long,
I'm
I don't know
sorry.
if he's
I'm
frozen or not.
sorry. Yeah, I'm on my
Uh,
phone. Somebody just mentioned my name and just
no, you're
keep
good.
going.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good. Nah, but while he's thinking of his next topic, just wanted to give y'all a disclaimer that in the next by 2022, me and AY will have a consistent schedule outline of of episodes that'll happen more consistently. So we're still working out the kinks this year, but in 2022 we'll most definitely have a more organized outline of how things will go. Reason being because your boy Malcolm is actually making a major move to Indianapolis by 2022, and we will try to create a way to where we can actually talk and connect one another in person on a consistent basis, just so we can make the podcasts and um, episodes more smoothly. And another disclaimer: our next episode, our next classic review episode that we will be doing will be none other than, drumroll please. We are doing Kendrick Lamar's Overly Dedicated. We mentioned it before in the last episode, about a couple months ago. The premise of like the classic reviews that we do is we want to touch on uh, low key artists or under the radar artists, but also artists that really are like mainstream and have a bunch of a large following. We want to touch on those projects that either establish their buzz or projects that just doesn't get the enough recognition or credit it deserves. And I feel like Overly Dedicated is one of them. It was between that or Section 80, but I feel like by the time he released Section 80, he already had a buzz going into Good Kid, Mad City. So I think Overly Dedicated is a great project that we should tap into, because you kind of get a chance to see a glimpse of what Kendrick was to be or is to be, what he is now through the lens of that mixtape. So yeah, any words you got pertaining to Overly Dedicated right now, even though we'll probably go into more of the particulars in that.
I think one is really underrated. Um, it partially makes me mad thinking about it just because I've only ever heard it on Apple Music, and I didn't know till recently that a lot of that tape is missing off of Apple Music. So I've still yet to have really
Yeah,
listened to the whole tape just because Apple Music sort of is
yeah,
missing, like, I want to say 3, 4 songs, and it's kind of out of order. So
yeah.
I'm gonna have to
I'm
find
about
it
to
on
say
YouTube.
I'm gonna send you. Yeah, I'm gonna send you the link is good because there's the Dat Piff version, there's the Mixtape Monkey version. Dat Piff obviously is the most credible source. It has it in the correct order. It also has some of the tracks that people didn't hear before. They had multiple versions of the song. Yeah, I did get the Apple Music version, and it was very like when I first listened to it, it was very weird because it was out of order, and I was like, "What the hell? This is not the next song." And like this is not the next song, and they missing this. But no, I'm really looking forward to reviewing that just because, for one, um, even though we gotten like tracks and stuff from Kendrick, obviously with the features and stuff like that, it just still feels like I haven't heard Kendrick in a long time. I mean, in terms of like
I'm the
album
old
stuff
maker.
and project stuff or whatever. Yeah, for real though, but like it really does because it's like he really I don't think he's gonna even release this year, quite honestly. And like if he release next year, it probably won't be until like February or March. And it'll mark exactly like what 5 years since his last album. Because he released April 21st. I don't know how I remember that date, but I want to say April 21st or April 21st. I want to say April 21st to April 28th of 2017. And that's well over 4 years ago. And yeah, I just think it'd be a good warm up into, the anticipation that we have for his next project. Or anytime he releases a project, it seems to have some type of shakeup of the industry or whatnot. And I'm just very, very excited for it. Um, while we're on the topic, how do you feel about him leaving TDE? I know that it happened like months ago, but we never really touched on that
Yeah,
topic of
yeah,
him
yeah. We can do this sort
parting
of.
ways from.
Yeah, sort of end the episode on a light note. I like that. I think it's interesting. I think one definitely caught me off guard, but two, in terms of who Kendrick is and how big he is, because yeah, I'm gonna say I think he's sort of outgrown just TDE in terms of like the scope and like his influence on hip hop compared to the rest of the people who are on the label, like his impact on the music industry. So I think
Mm,
he's really established himself to the point where now he feels like he can have his own record label, and he'd rather go at it at his own, and he wants to sort of try his hand at having his own sort of record label and really being able to control, I guess maybe his music or something. I'm not sure. I don't think anything's come out saying like TDE sort of restricted his ability to release music or make music, but part of me feels like that's probably why he left, just because
yeah,
TDE wasn't necessarily allowing him to release music when he wanted it. And so I see this as sort of him just a new chapter in his life, to where he's probably going to start releasing probably music a little more frequently, and just being able to really do more of, I guess, what he
mm,
wants to do.
yeah. No, two things. One, he has a good rapport with obviously Top Dog and the people that are like the head of TDE. But as we all know, TDE is a well-oiled machine, and they are very, very methodical and about how they go about releasing music, how they go about releasing albums. There's a reason why like there's not really an artist on the label that releases an album back to back or release a project back to back, or is all like, what I'm saying, like the accessibility of some of these artists come through some of the features at times and stuff like that, but like you don't see them releasing that many Lucy's or that many just lingering singles like that. They're quite methodical. The only time you can say they actually had like a little spurt of time where they were just, in the mix of just like releasing music was, I guess, and it really wasn't even TDE. It was more of Kendrick because he was the creator. But like, when they did the Black Panther project, and that wasn't even really like TDE per se. It was more of Kendrick being kind of the pseudo executive producer of the project. But I do think him having his own label, PG Lang, I think that's what it's called.
PG
I'm
Lang,
gonna call it Label Splash. PG Lang. It's I'm gonna call it label slash new movement that he has. It's part of the reason, obviously, him working alongside Baby Keem is could be a thing, and him also maybe wanting to be like an executive producer, and like you mentioned, like just his own boss when it comes to having a label and stuff like that kind of plays a role too. And I honestly think that and it could be, and I hope not, but it could very well be that he's probably trying to transition out of music, and with TDE kind of being like a company, its own label, but it kind of is tied in with Interscope
yeah,
and Aftermath to a certain extent. There's probably some obligations when it comes to having to release music, having to spend having to put this amount of work into releasing music and stuff like that. Maybe he didn't want to do that no more. But obviously we don't know the full ins and outs, so we shouldn't speculate that much. But I feel like there's some underlying things as to why he parted ways. But as you mentioned, I don't think it's any ill will towards management or anything like that. Even though it's been quite interesting, it's been funny because SZA, Absol, Isaiah Rashad, and even Reason to a certain extent, like you heard mutterings about how like they're kind of at odds with the label when it comes to them wanting to release music.
mm-hmm.
But it hasn't been to the point where like they've been outright like upset with management. Like they all obviously have like great deal of respect for Top Dog, the main guy of the label, and whatnot. But they're still to a certain degree, they're a little bit at odds with like how they kind of have to go about releasing music. I know Absol and SZA are two that are most definitely the most, bothered by how like the lack of frequency they're able to release music. Absol hasn't released since 2016, and that hasn't been by design, or that has been by design through the label, but not like because of his wants or whatever. Same thing with SZA. SZA hasn't released since 2017 either, and I'm pretty sure that she wants to release music a lot more frequently too. But yeah, no, but I think it's very interesting to see the route that he takes and just kind of what he's gonna do, because this is his final TDE album. Like this is an end of an era,
Oh
and
my,
it's crazy because I'm about to say it's crazy because it's like like we've been pushing for like a TDE compilation project for a long time, and I feel like the closest thing we got to that was the Black Panther project. Um, so yeah, it's been a ride. I mean, TDE's been around. Technically, it's been around since '03, when J Rock was first on the label. Just
mm-hmm.
a historical reference. When he was on the label, he had songs with Lil Wayne and stuff like that. And then before you knew it, Kendrick joined. Then Absol. Then Schoolboy. Then before you know it, then you had Black Hippie. And then before you know it, more and more people started to join. They added Isaiah Rashad, they added SZA, they added Sir, they added Lance Skywalker, Reason. They just added a new guy. I forget his name, but he's pretty solid too. But yeah, no, it's very interesting to see where they go from here. But as long as they're releasing good music, I mean, everything is copacetic. Oh, I got to go into this. Shout out to your boy for winning album of the year with the Hip Hop Awards. They showed him love, man. They showed him love. Shout out to him. Shout out to him. Kendrick, or not Kendrick. J. Cole won Lyricist of the
Yeah,
Year.
and then I think Tyler also won like cultural like influencer or something like that too.
Yeah, yeah. Shout out to both of them boys, and also shout out to my homegirl Rhapsody and my boy Tigger. They're bringing back the basement freestyle. So like they're bringing back the rapping in the basement segment or whatever. They used to be very prominent. If you're not familiar with that, just go back and look at when Jay-Z, Lil Wayne, The Game, and a couple other people had like these infamous freestyles in the basement. It's pretty dope or whatever. They kind of alluded to that before though, because G Herbo was on there, and he kind of when he did his little interview or whatever, he kind of did like a pseudo freestyle, or not pseudo freestyle, but he did a freestyle over the 95 South beat or whatever. So they've had people freestyle on the outlet before, but I think they're starting to trying to bring it back now, which is interesting because like I feel like we live in a generation now that don't really value. And it's funny because I remember Nate Marshall asked on Twitter, like, you know, do people even do like ciphers or freestyles anymore or whatever? Like not the double XL cipher where like they get a bunch of like up and coming artists and like throw them out there and like they give some verses. That he's talking about like some actual like, you know, improv ciphers or whatever. And you know, it's kind of interesting how they're trying to kind of preserve like some, I guess, forms of hip hop that's kind of dying off or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah.
All right, but that's all we got, man. We really appreciate you guys.
Let me get the outro music going. Damn, man, hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Protection.
I'm all right with transitions, man.
Go ahead.
No, we really appreciate you guys. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, the next episode or next classic review, because we're gonna do an episode unrelated to that, but the next episode for the classic review will be Kendrick Lamar's Overly Dedicated, came out in 2010. And like I said, by 2022, we're gonna have everything figured out, bro. I'm gonna be fully moved into Indianapolis, you know, next year. I will be seeing AY in person a lot more often. Hopefully with our
Might
work
even be
schedule
roommates.
permits.
You never know.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna make this a well-oiled machine by the time 2022 comes. AY, you got anything to say?
Appreciate y'all for joining me, man. I'll make one quick note before the episode ends. So tomorrow, Malcolm, during study tables, I plan on teaching our players who are there about Malcolm X. And I'm doing like this sort of 4-part lecture, so we'll see how that goes. I mean, I don't think it'll be too hard just because I've been doing it for years, but you know, I'm excited for that. But appreciate y'all listening. Have a good morning, good night, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you are listening to this, we appreciate you. We love y'all, and we're out.
Gonna leave a wooden pen and paper, promise that my soul gonna bleed. My mama tell me, baby boy, pray all you need. It's true because my pole code don't make me change the